My name is Morgan Tate. I'm 37, and until recently, I was the Senior Technical Director at Avanix Solutions, a defense contractor headquartered in Salt Lake City. I want to tell you how they fired me just days before my stock options vested and how I made them regret that decision for years to come. I remember the day I joined Avanix like it was yesterday. It was a scrappy startup with barely 20 employees working out of what used to be a renovated warehouse. The smell of fresh paint and ambition filled the air. Grant Holloway, the CEO, sold me on a vision of transparency and accountability in the defense sector, an industry notorious for its opacity and waste. We need someone who can build systems that hold everyone accountable, Grant had said during my interview. Someone who isn't afraid to speak truth to power. I believed him. I believed in the mission. After 5 years at Raytheon, where I'd grown increasingly frustrated with the deliberate inefficiencies and bloat I witnessed, Avanix felt like a breath of fresh air. My background as a systems integration engineer made me uniquely qualified to design verification and validation protocols for military-grade equipment. In simpler terms, I created the systems that ensure defense contractors deliver exactly what they promise to the government. No shortcuts, no substitutions, no hidden flaws. Within my first year, I conceived and began building ClearTrace, an integrated verification system that would become the cornerstone of Avanix's appeal to the Department of Defense. ClearTrace combined AI inspection protocols with blockchain verification, creating an immutable record of every step in the manufacturing and testing process. It wasn't just innovative, it was revolutionary for an industry that operated largely on paperwork and trust. This is the future of defense contracting, Grant had proclaimed when I first demonstrated the prototype. This is how we're going to win the big contracts. He wasn't wrong. 3 years into my tenure, as Avanix grew from 20 employees to over 200, the Department of Defense announced a $1.4 billion contract for next-generation radar systems. The bid specifications included a requirement for advanced digital verification and validation protocols with immutable record-keeping capabilities. It was as if they had written the specs with ClearTrace in mind. And perhaps they had. I'd spent countless hours demonstrating the system to various DoD officials, explaining how it could save taxpayer money and improve accountability. The night we received word that Avanix had been selected as the primary contractor, Grant hosted a company-wide celebration. Champagne flowed freely as he toasted the team and, specifically, my contribution. Morgan built the system that won us this contract, he announced to thunderous applause. And when your stock options vest next month, Morgan, you'll finally get the reward you deserve. I smiled and raised my glass, thinking about the $850,000 in equity that was just weeks away from becoming mine. After 4 years of 80-hour weeks, of missing holidays with family and friends, of pouring my heart and soul into building something I believed in, I was finally going to reap the rewards. But then came the first warning sign. 2 weeks after we won the contract, Grant introduced Lindsay Barrett as our new Chief Operating Officer. Lindsay came from a finance background with a stint at a major defense contractor I'd rather not name. She had no technical expertise, but carried herself with the sharp confidence of someone who had climbed corporate ladders by stepping on others. We need to streamline operations now that we're playing in the big leagues, Grant explained when I questioned why we needed a new COO just as we were about to begin the most significant project in company history. Lindsay wasted no time in asserting her authority. In our first meeting to discuss the radar system rollout, she suggested we adjust some of the performance metrics in our demonstration to the federal inspection team. The actual capabilities exceed requirements in most areas, she said, sliding a document across the table to me. But there are 2 parameters where we're just slightly under. If we could just optimize how the system reports these metrics, we'd make a better impression. I stared at her in disbelief. You want me to manipulate the validation system? The entire point of ClearTrace is that it can't be manipulated. Lindsay's smile didn't waver. I'm not suggesting manipulation, Morgan, just presentation optimization. Everyone does it. Not at Avanix, I replied firmly, and certainly not with my system. The tension between us grew over the following weeks. Lindsay began scheduling technical meetings without including me. I would later learn from colleagues that she was exploring ways to update ClearTrace without my involvement. Exactly 9 days before my stock options were set to vest, 9 days before I would officially own $850,000 in equity, I received a calendar invitation for an urgent meeting with Grant and Lindsay. The subject line simply read, Strategic Reorganization. I knew before I even entered the conference room what was about to happen. Grant couldn't quite meet my eyes as I took a seat. Lindsay, on the other hand, maintained perfect eye contact, her expression a mask of professional regret. Morgan, Grant began, his voice strained. As we prepare for the next phase of growth and eventual IPO, we've had to make some difficult decisions about our organizational structure. I remained silent, waiting for him to get to the point. We've determined that your role as it currently exists doesn't align with our future needs. We're eliminating the senior technical director position effective immediately. The room seemed to tilt slightly. 4 years of my life, countless innovations, a system that had literally won them a billion-dollar contract, and just like that, I was being discarded. This has nothing to do with your performance, Lindsay added, sliding a folder across the table. We're offering 2 months severance, which is generous considering company policy only requires 1. My voice, when I finally found it, was surprisingly steady. And my stock options, they vest in 9 days. Grant at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. Unfortunately, unvested options are forfeited upon termination. That's standard in the employee agreement. Of course it was. And of course they knew exactly what they were doing by firing me just days before vesting. They were saving themselves $850,000 at the expense of the person who had made them billions. I signed the paperwork wordlessly, handed in my badge and laptop, and walked out of the building that had been my second home for 4 years. No goodbye party, no chance to collect personal items from my office, not even a company-wide email thanking me for my service. I was erased. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at the wall, a glass of whiskey untouched beside me. I wasn't just angry, I was heartbroken. I had believed in Avenix's mission, I had believed in Grant. I had poured my soul into building something I thought would make a difference. And they had discarded me like yesterday's trash to save a few $100,000 pocket change compared to the contract I had helped secure. The next morning, I woke up with clarity and purpose. They had taken my job and my equity, but they had overlooked something crucial. ClearTrace wasn't just a system I had built, it was a system that required my ongoing participation. You see, the $1.4 billion contract included a specific clause about verification protocols. Each shipment of radar equipment required digital authentication from the technical lead who had been approved by the Defense Technology Agency. That was me. ClearTrace was designed to require multi-factor authentication for final verification, including biometric confirmation from an authorized individual. And I was the only authorized individual. I picked up my phone and called Alan Chen, my deputy who had worked with me on ClearTrace from the beginning. Alan, how's it going over there? I asked when he answered. His voice was hushed. It's chaos, Morgan. They're trying to figure out how to verify the first shipment without you, but the system keeps rejecting all attempts. I couldn't help but smile. That's because it's working exactly as designed. Lindsay's on the warpath. She's convinced you sabotaged the system before you left. I didn't have to, I replied. The requirement for my authentication was built in from the beginning and approved by the DoD. It's in the contract specifications. Alan let out a low whistle. The first payment from the government is contingent on that initial shipment. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars sitting in limbo. What a shame, I said, surprised by how little sympathy I felt. 1 week after my termination, I received an email from Avenix's legal department. They were offering me a consulting agreement, $10,000 per day to help resolve technical issues with the ClearTrace system. I didn't respond. 3 days later, my phone rang with Grant's number. I let it go to voicemail. His message was a strange mix of apology and desperation. Morgan, We clearly made a mistake. The reorganization was premature. We need your expertise to fulfill our contractual obligations. Please call me back so we can discuss your return with your stock options fully vested. Of course. I deleted the message without calling back. The next day, Lindsay herself called. I answered, curious to hear what she would say. "Morgan, this is childish," she began, dispensing with pleasantries. "You're jeopardizing a critical national security contract because your feelings are hurt. The system is working exactly as designed and approved by the DoD. I replied calmly. "If you can't make it work, perhaps you shouldn't have fired the person who designed it." "We'll sue you for sabotage," she threatened. "For what?" "For building a secure system that prevents unauthorized modifications, exactly what the government paid for. Good luck with that lawsuit." I hung up and blocked her number. What Avenix failed to understand was that I hadn't sabotaged anything. ClearTrace was functioning perfectly, doing exactly what it was designed to do: prevent unauthorized alterations and ensure accountability. The fact that I was the only authorized verifier wasn't a bug. It was a feature explicitly approved by the Department of Defense to prevent the exact kind of manipulation Lindsay had suggested. While Avenix scrambled, I made plans of my own. I had sold a portion of my initially vested shares the previous year, netting about $300,000. It wasn't the $850,000 I should have received, but it was enough to start over. I incorporated Tate Verify, a company specializing in verification and validation systems for defense and energy contracts. My vision was to create an improved version of ClearTrace One that would set the industry standard for accountability and transparency. Within 6 months, I had assembled a small team of engineers, including Alan Chen, who left Avenix after witnessing how they had treated me. We worked tirelessly to develop Verify Chain, a system that improved on ClearTrace's foundation with more advanced biometric security and distributed verification protocols. Meanwhile, Avenix was imploding. Unable to deliver the first radar shipment on schedule, they triggered penalty clauses in the government contract. The financial press caught wind of the story, and their stock price began to slide. Investors started asking uncomfortable questions about why a billion-dollar company was being held hostage by verification software they supposedly owned. 8 months after my termination, I received a call from Eleanor Wright, the Defense Technology Agency's chief procurement officer. I had worked extensively with Eleanor during the contract negotiations. "Morgan, I've been following your new venture with interest," she said after we exchanged pleasantries. "We're having some core issues with the Avenix contract that I believe you might be able to help with." "I'm listening," I replied, though I had a pretty good idea what those issues entailed. Avenix has failed to deliver verified equipment for 3 consecutive quarters. They've requested multiple extensions and even attempted to modify the contract to remove the ClearTrace verification requirement. We've denied these requests, of course. I remained silent, letting her continue. "The DoD is considering terminating the contract for non-performance. Before we take that step, I wanted to discuss alternatives. Would Tate Verify be in a position to step in as a verification consultant?" It was the opportunity I'd been waiting for, though it had arrived sooner than expected. "We would certainly be interested in discussing that possibility. Eleanor, Verify Chain, our new system, addresses many of the limitations that appear to be causing problems with the current implementation." 2 weeks later, I was back in the Pentagon, demonstrating Verify Chain to a room full of procurement officials and technical advisors. The system's distributed verification architecture, which allowed for multiple authorized verifiers while maintaining rigorous security, impressed them considerably. By the 1-year anniversary of my termination from Avenix, the landscape had changed dramatically. The Department of Defense had indeed terminated the $1.4 billion contract with Avenix for non-performance. Their stock had plummeted by more than 70%, and Grant had been forced to resign as CEO. Lindsay was under investigation for allegedly attempting to manipulate technical specifications on federal contracts, apparently. I wasn't the only one who had refused her optimization requests. Tate Verify, meanwhile, had secured a $620 million contract to provide verification services for 3 major defense programs. including the renamed radar initiative that Avenix had failed to deliver. We had grown from 5 employees to 50, with plans to double again within the year. But the most satisfying moment came during the National Defense Technology Conference in Washington, D.C. I had been invited to speak about innovation in accountability systems, a topic that had gained significant attention following the Avenix debacle. As I took the stage, I spotted Grant in the audience, looking considerably older than when I had last seen him. Transparency isn't just a buzzword, I began, surveying the packed auditorium. It's a technical challenge that requires deliberate design and unwavering commitment. Systems of accountability must be immune to manipulation, even especially when that manipulation would benefit those in power. I didn't mention Avenix by name. I didn't have to. Everyone in the industry knew the story by now. When Tate Verify designs verification systems, we build them with the understanding that they will inevitably be tested not just by external threats, but by internal pressures. By those who might value expedience over integrity, or profit over purpose. Grant stood up and left before I finished speaking. I watched him go without breaking stride in my presentation. His departure was its own kind of vindication. After the conference, Eleanor Wright approached me with a smile. "The secretary wants to meet you," she said, gesturing toward a small group of officials near the stage. "There's talk of expanding the verification requirements to all major defense acquisitions. Your timing couldn't be better." As I followed Eleanor toward what would become one of the most important meetings of my career, I reflected on the journey of the past year. Avenix had fired me to save $850,000 in stock options, only to lose a $1.4 billion contract and most of their market value as a result. They had violated my trust and betrayed their own stated values, all in the name of short-term gain. But in doing so, they had inadvertently launched me on a path to something far greater than I would have achieved had they treated me fairly. Tate Verify wasn't just successful, it was meaningful. We were changing how an entire industry operated, forcing accountability where there had been little before. Sometimes I wonder if I should thank them for firing me. But then I remember those dark days after my termination, the betrayal, the anger, the uncertainty, and I decide that some debts can never truly be repaid. Instead, I focus on building something they never could, a company where integrity isn't just a marketing slogan, but the foundation of everything we do. A company that keeps its promises, both to its clients and to its people. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. Not revenge, satisfying as it may have been. Not even justice, necessary though it was. It's about creating systems both technological and human that bring out our best rather than enabling our worst. And every time I sign off on a verification protocol that prevents someone from cutting corners or hiding flaws, I know that I've succeeded where Avenix failed. That's a victory worth far more than $850,000 in stock options. That's a legacy. The weeks following my firing from Avenix were some of the darkest of my life. I'd never experienced betrayal on such a personal level before. Grant had been more than a boss. He'd been a mentor, someone I trusted implicitly. Learning that he valued $850,000 over our 4-year professional relationship was a bitter pill to swallow. I cycled through the stages of grief like clockwork. Denial came first. Surely there was some mistake, some misunderstanding that could be corrected. Then, anger. Burning white-hot whenever I thought about Lindsay's smug expression as she slid that insulting severance package across the table. Bargaining followed. Maybe if I called Grant, appealed to our history together, he would reconsider. Depression hit me hardest, leaving me staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., questioning every career decision I'd ever made. But acceptance that never quite arrived. Instead, it morphed into something else entirely: determination. I knew that Avenix would eventually contact me about ClearTrace. The system had been deliberately designed with me as the sole verification authority, not out of ego, but because the Department of Defense had specifically requested a single point of accountability for the verification process. Someone whose professional reputation was on the line with every approval. The DoD had been burned too many times by diffuse responsibility structures where everyone could point fingers at everyone else when things went wrong. They wanted one name, one person who couldn't hide behind committees or group decisions. That person was me. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly Avenix would realize their predicament. I had expected at least a month before the first shipment was due for verification. Instead, it took just 8 days before Grant's desperate voicemail arrived. I replayed it several times, savoring each note of panic in his voice. The man who couldn't look me in the eye when firing me was now practically begging for my help. It was petty, perhaps, but deeply satisfying. On day 10 post-termination, a courier arrived at my apartment with a hand-delivered letter from Avenix's board of directors. They were offering full reinstatement, my stock options with immediate vesting, plus a $250,000 signing bonus as recognition of your invaluable contribution to the company's success. I burned the letter in my kitchen sink and sent a photo of the ashes to Grant's personal email. Childish, perhaps? Cathartic, absolutely. By day 14, the situation at Avenix had escalated to crisis level. Alan kept me informed through daily texts that painted a picture of increasing desperation. Lindsay had brought in 3 different cybersecurity firms to try to bypass ClearTrace's authentication requirements. All had failed. She actually asked if we could just Photoshop your biometric signature. Alan texted one evening. When the security consultant explained that wasn't how blockchain verification worked, she threw her coffee mug across the room. I laughed out loud at that image. Lindsay, with her MBA in financial engineering background, had never bothered to understand the technical underpinnings of ClearTrace. She had dismissed it as just another verification system that could surely be worked around if necessary. But ClearTrace wasn't just another system. It represented years of development and innovation. The biometric verification was tied to my unique physiological markers, fingerprints, retinal scans, and voice patterns, all hashed and stored on a distributed ledger that would immediately flag any attempt at duplication or simulation. By the 3rd week, Avenix's desperation reached new heights. I received a call from Timothy Walsh, the company's lead counsel. "Ms. Tate," he began formally, "I'm calling to discuss an amenable resolution to our current impasse." "I wasn't aware we had an impasse, Mr. Walsh," I replied coolly. "Avenix terminated my employment. That seems pretty definitive to me." He cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Yes. Well, regarding that termination, it appears there may have been some precipitous decision-making that the board is now reconsidering." Precipitous, I repeated. "Is that legal jargon for we fired you 9 days before your stock options vested to save money, and now we're facing the consequences?" His silence was answer enough. "The board has authorized me to offer you a comprehensive settlement package," he continued eventually. "Full reinstatement of your unvested stock options, to be vested immediately upon your signature, plus a consulting fee of $50,000 per day for as long as needed to resolve the current verification issues." It was substantially more than their previous offers, which told me just how desperate they had become. The first government payment milestone was approaching, and without a verified shipment, that payment likely hundreds of millions of dollars would be withheld. "I'm afraid I'm not interested in returning to Avenix in any capacity, Mr. Walsh." "Ms. Tate, please understand this is now affecting national security interests. The Department of Defense is expecting delivery of critical radar systems." That made me pause. I had no desire to hinder legitimate defense priorities. "Has the DoD reached out directly regarding this issue?" "Not yet," Walsh admitted, "but it's only a matter of time." "Then I suggest Avenix be transparent with them about the situation. Explain that you fired the only authorized verification engineer 9 days before her equity vested, and now you're unable to fulfill your contractual obligations as a result." I could practically hear him wincing through the phone. "Surely we can reach some arrangement that doesn't require that level of disclosure." "I'm not interested in arrangements, Mr. Walsh. I'm interested in accountability. Isn't that what Avenix claims to value above all else?" After hanging up, I immediately called Eleanor Wright at the Defense Technology Agency. I had worked closely with Eleanor throughout the contract negotiation process and respected her integrity. If there were genuine national security concerns, I wanted to hear them directly from the DoD, not filtered through Avenix's desperate legal team. Morgan, Eleanor greeted me warmly. I was wondering when I'd hear from you. The grapevine says you've left Avenix rather abruptly. Not by choice, I replied. I was terminated 9 days before my stock options vested. Eleanor let out a low whistle. That explains a few things. We received a rather panicked communication from them yesterday about unforeseen technical challenges with the verification system. Let me guess they didn't mention that the technical challenge was firing the only authorized verification engineer. They were notably vague on specifics, Eleanor confirmed, a hint of amusement in her voice. Should I be concerned about delivery timelines? I considered this carefully. As angry as I was with Avenix, I had no desire to undermine legitimate defense projects. The verification system is functioning exactly as designed and approved by the DoD. I explained. The problem isn't technical, it's personnel. Avenix eliminated the role required by the contract specifications. I see. Eleanor's tone turned serious. And if they were to reinstate that role? They've tried. I've declined. Because of the stock options? Partly, I admitted. But it's more than that. They've demonstrated a fundamental lack of integrity. I can no longer vouch for their processes or their products, which is essentially what my verification signature does. Eleanor was silent for a moment, considering. The radar systems are important, Morgan, but not at the expense of the verification standards we've established. That's actually why I wanted to speak with you. There's been discussion about extending similar verification requirements to all major defense acquisitions. Your work with ClearTrace has opened a lot of eyes. This was news to me. Really? The accountability gap in defense contracting is something we've struggled with for decades. Your system offers a potential solution. In fact, there's a committee meeting next week to discuss establishing new standards based on ClearTrace's architecture. My mind raced with the implications. I'd be happy to contribute to that discussion. I was hoping you'd say that, Eleanor replied. And in the meantime, what should we do about Avenix and the radar contract? The contract specifies that verification must come through the approved system by the approved technical authority. I said, if Avenix can't meet those terms, they should be held to the same standards as any other contractor. Even if that means terminating a $1.4 billion contract. Even then, I confirmed, accountability means nothing if we waive it when it becomes inconvenient. After our call, I felt simultaneously lighter and more burdened. On one hand, it was validating to hear that my work had influenced thinking at the DoD level. On the other, I was now directly involved in a situation that could affect a major defense contract and, potentially, national security interests. The following day, I received another unexpected call, this time from James Harrison, one of Avenix's founding board members and someone I'd always respected for his technical background and integrity. Morgan, he began without preamble. We've really stepped in it this time, haven't we? His candor surprised me. That's one way to put it. I want you to know that the decision to terminate your position was not unanimous. Some of us argued strongly against it. But not strongly enough, apparently. He sighed heavily. No, not strongly enough. And for that, I owe you an apology. It was the first genuine apology I'd received from anyone at Avenix, and it caught me off guard. I appreciate that, James. The board is meeting tonight to discuss next steps. Grant is suggesting we pursue legal action against you for, these are his words, not mine, deliberately sabotaging company operations. I felt a surge of indignation. The system is operating exactly as designed and contractually specified. There's no sabotage. I know that, James assured me. And I suspect most of the board knows it too, though some are more willing to admit it than others. The question is where we go from here. I considered my response carefully. What do you think should happen, James? Honestly, I think we should admit our mistake, reinstate you with your full equity compensation, and work to rebuild trust. but I'm not sure I have the votes to make that happen. And if you did have the votes, he paused. Would you come back, Morgan, if we made it right? It was a question I had asked myself repeatedly over the past few weeks. Could I return to Avenix if they made proper amends? Could I work alongside people who had demonstrated such a fundamental lack of integrity? No, I said finally. I couldn't trust the company again, but I would be willing to provide transitional assistance enough to fulfill the existing contract if certain conditions were met. What conditions? Grant and Lindsay would need to resign. The company would need to issue a public statement acknowledging what happened, and my equity would need to be restored and vested immediately, with additional compensation for the damage to my professional reputation. James let out a low whistle. Those are steep terms. So was firing me 9 days before my equity vested to save the company money, only to jeopardize a $1 billion contract in the process. Fair point. I'll bring your terms to the board, but I won't sugarcoat it. I don't think they'll agree to all of them. He was right. The board meeting that night apparently devolved into a shouting match, with Grant arguing vehemently against any admission of wrongdoing and James pushing for a clean break and fresh start. In the end, they reached a deadlocked non-decision. They would continue trying to modify the ClearTrace system while simultaneously pursuing legal options to force my cooperation. It was exactly the worst possible approach, a half measure that committed to nothing while prolonging the crisis. But it was also revealing, even facing the potential loss of their largest contract. Avenix's leadership couldn't bring themselves to admit their mistake and make proper amends. And that, more than anything else, confirmed that leaving Avenix behind was the right decision. The next day, I filed the paperwork to officially incorporate Tate Verify. It wasn't just an act of defiance or a backup plan anymore, it was my future. As I signed the incorporation documents, I felt a sense of closure. Whatever happened with Avenix and the radar contract, I was moving forward. I would build something new, something better, something truly aligned with the values of transparency and accountability that Avenix had only pretended to uphold. Little did I know that within a year, Tate Verify would not only surpass Avenix in reputation, but would fundamentally reshape how the entire defense industry approached verification and accountability. The journey was just beginning. 3 months after my termination from Avenix, their stock had dropped by 35%. The first quarter financial report revealed they had missed the initial payment milestone on the radar contract, resulting in a $175 million penalty and triggering a cascade of investor concerns. I learned from Alan, who had recently resigned to join Tate Verify, that the internal situation had deteriorated significantly. Grant and Lindsay were barely on speaking terms, each blaming the other for the ClearTrace fiasco. The engineering team had been divided into 3 separate groups, all working frantically on different approaches to bypass or recreate the verification system. It's chaos, Alan explained as we shared lunch at a cafe near Tate Verify's small office space. Half the original tech team has quit. The ones who remain are working 14-hour days trying to reverse engineer your authentication protocols. They won't succeed, I said with certainty. The biometric markers are encrypted with a private key that only I possess, and they're validated against a distributed ledger that would immediately flag any attempt at forgery. Alan nodded. Lindsay finally figured that out. Now she's pushing a completely different approach. They're trying to convince the DoD to accept an alternative verification methodology that doesn't require the original ClearTrace protocols. I raised an eyebrow. How's that going? Alan grinned. About as well as you'd expect. The contract specifically requires ClearTrace by name. The DoD has rejected 3 different alternative proposals so far. I couldn't help feeling a twinge of satisfaction at this news, though I tried not to show it. Schadenfreude wasn't a particularly noble emotion, after all. What about the radar systems themselves? I asked. Are they still in production? That's the other problem, Alan said, lowering his voice slightly. Without the continuous verification that ClearTrace was supposed to provide throughout the manufacturing process, they can't be certain that all components meet specifications. They're essentially building hardware blind, hoping they can verify it all retroactively if they ever solve the authentication issue. This was concerning. ClearTrace hadn't just been a final approval stamp, it had been designed to monitor and verify every stage of production. Building without that verification meant potential quality issues that would be difficult or impossible to detect later. That's not just contractually problematic, I said. It's potentially dangerous. These systems are going into critical defense applications. Alan nodded gravely. I know. That's part of why I left. When I raised those concerns with Lindsay, she told me to focus on solutions, not problems. When I pointed out that quality assurance is focusing on solutions, she suggested I might not be a good cultural fit for the new Avenix. I shook my head in disgust. The new Avenix apparently had no room for actual engineering ethics. Meanwhile, Tate Verify was gaining momentum faster than I had anticipated. Eleanor Wright had introduced me to several key figures at the Department of Defense, all of whom were intrigued by the verification crisis at Avenix and impressed by the underlying technology that had created it. What you've built is exactly what we've been looking for, explained Colonel Robert Jenkins, head of acquisition technology for the Air Force, during one such meeting. The ability to create an immutable record of compliance throughout the manufacturing process, not just at final inspection, could revolutionize how we manage contractor oversight. This was validation of the highest order. The principles I had built into ClearTrace principles that Avenix had ultimately rejected were being recognized as vital by the very people the system was designed to serve. Within 4 months of founding Tate Verify, we had secured our first contract, a modest $3.2 million deal to develop verification protocols for a satellite communication system. It wasn't billions, but it was a start. And more importantly, it was built on genuine appreciation for the accountability mechanisms I had pioneered. The real breakthrough came 6 months after my departure from Avenix, when the Department of Defense officially announced it was terminating the radar contract for non-performance. The press release was diplomatic, but devastating. After multiple extensions and failure to meet contractually specified verification requirements, the Department of Defense has determined that Avenix Solutions is unable to fulfill the terms of the Next-Gen Radar Systems contract. The department will begin a new solicitation process immediately. Avenix's stock plummeted an additional 40% overnight. Financial analysts who had previously hailed the company as a rising star in the defense sector now questioned its fundamental viability. Grant issued a desperate statement promising a thorough review of internal processes and assuring investors that Avenix was well-positioned to overcome these temporary challenges. The market wasn't convinced, neither was I. 2 days after the contract termination announcement, I received a call from Eleanor Wright. Morgan, have you been following the news? About Avenix, it's hard to miss. Indeed. She paused momentarily. The secretary has authorized an expedited contract process for the radar systems. Given the national security implications, we can't afford the usual 12 to 18-month bidding cycle. I waited, sensing there was more. The new contract will be structured differently, she continued. Rather than a single prime contractor, we're considering a modular approach with separate contracts for hardware manufacturing and verification services. Now I understood why she was calling. And you're interested in Tate Verify for the verification component. Precisely. The failure with Avenix has made it abundantly clear that verification can't be controlled by the same entity responsible for production. It creates inherent conflicts of interest. This was something I had argued for years, often to deaf ears. The idea that contractors should essentially verify their own work had always seemed fundamentally flawed to me. We'd like to bring you in next week to discuss specifications for a standalone verification contract. Eleanor continued. The secretary is particularly interested in your distributed verification concept, the one you mentioned during our last conversation. The distributed verification concept was the core of Verify Chain, the system we were developing at Tate Verify. Unlike ClearTrace, which had been designed with me as the single point of verification, Verify Chain allowed for multiple authorized verifiers while maintaining rigorous security through a consensus mechanism. No single person, not even me, would be able to unilaterally approve or block verification. We'd be very interested in that discussion, I replied, trying to keep the excitement from my voice. The meeting the following week exceeded all expectations. What had started as a discussion about verification for the radar project expanded into a broader conversation about establishing new standards for all major defense acquisitions. What we're envisioning, explained Undersecretary Phillips, is a fundamental restructuring of how verification works across the entire defense procurement system: independent verification services, standardized protocols, immutable record-keeping, all the principles you pioneered with ClearTrace, but implemented at an institutional level. By the end of the meeting, we had outlined the framework for not just one contract, but an entirely new approach to defense verification. Tate Verify would develop the core technology and protocols, which would then be mandated for all major defense contracts moving forward. As we were wrapping up, Eleanor pulled me aside. "There's something else you should know," she said quietly. "The Justice Department has opened an investigation into Avenix, specifically focusing on Lindsay Barrett's activities before and after your termination." This was unexpected. "What kind of investigation?" "They're looking into allegations that she attempted to manipulate verification data on multiple government contracts, not just the radar system. Apparently, your refusal to cooperate wasn't the first time she'd suggested optimizing test results." I felt a complex mix of emotions: vindication, certainly, but also sadness that the company I'd once believed in had fallen so far. "One of your former colleagues came forward with emails," Eleanor continued. "Messages where Lindsay explicitly directed engineering staff to alter test results before submission to federal inspectors. That would explain the chaos Alan had described, not just a technical crisis, but an ethical one, potentially with criminal implications." The news about the Justice Department investigation broke publicly 2 weeks later. Grant issued a statement expressing shock and dismay at the allegations and announcing Lindsay's immediate suspension pending the outcome of the investigation. The stock, already battered, fell another 15%. Meanwhile, Tate Verify continued its meteoric rise. The radar verification contract, worth $220 million over 5 years, was just the beginning. As word spread about the new verification standards being developed, other defense contractors began approaching us, eager to get ahead of requirements that would soon become mandatory. 8 months after my termination from Avenix, Tate Verify had grown to 75 employees and secured contracts totaling over $400 million. We had moved from our modest initial office to a gleaming new headquarters in downtown Salt Lake City, ironically, just 3 blocks from Avenix's increasingly empty building. It was during this period that I received perhaps the most surprising communication of all: a handwritten letter from Grant Holloway. "Morgan," it began, "I've written this letter a dozen times in my head over the past months, and each version seems inadequate. There is no adequate way to apologize for the magnitude of my mistake in allowing your termination to proceed." The letter continued for several pages, detailing how he had been blinded by short-term financial considerations and failed to stand up for the values the company was founded upon. He explained that he had resigned as CEO the previous week and was cooperating fully with the Justice Department investigation. "What you've built with Tate Verify is what Avenix should have been," he wrote toward the end. "You've created something with genuine integrity, something that truly serves the public interest rather than just claiming to. I won't ask for forgiveness, as I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I recognize the full extent of my failure, both as a CEO and as someone who once considered you a friend." I read the letter several times, unsure how to feel. There was a part of me that wanted to dismiss it as the desperate flailing of a man watching his life's work crumble. But there was also something genuine in his words that resonated with me. I never replied to Grant's letter. Some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt. But I did keep it, tucked away in my desk drawer, as a reminder of how easily principles can be compromised when put to the test, and how important it was that Tate Verify never make the same mistake. The true culmination of Tate Verify's first year came with the announcement of the National Defense Verification Standards Act, legislation that would codify many of the principles we had pioneered into federal law. I was invited to testify before Congress about the importance of independent verification systems in ensuring both taxpayer value and national security. The fundamental problem, I explained to the committee, is one of aligned incentives. When the same entity that profits from production is also responsible for verification, there will always be pressure to prioritize speed and cost over quality and compliance. What we need is a system where verification is truly independent financially, operationally, and technically. The legislation passed with broad bipartisan support, a rarity in the polarized political climate. President Hayes signed it into law 6 weeks later, with me standing just behind his right shoulder in the official photographs. As I watched the president sign the bill that would fundamentally reshape how defense contracts were verified and managed, I couldn't help reflecting on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. If Avenix hadn't fired me, if they had allowed my stock to vest and continued treating me with the respect I had earned, I would likely still be there, still working on ClearTrace, still trying to push for greater accountability from within a system that ultimately rejected those values. Instead, their betrayal had freed me to build something far more impactful. Tate Verify wasn't just a successful company. It was the catalyst for institutional change on a scale I could never have achieved at Avenix. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives, the betrayals, the losses, the injustices create openings for something far greater than what was taken from us. Not immediately, and not without pain, but eventually. As we celebrated the bill signing that evening, Eleanor Wright raised her glass in a toast. To Morgan Tate, she said, who turned a $850,000 loss into a revolution. I smiled and raised my own glass. To integrity, I replied, may it always be more valuable than stock options. The transformation of the defense contracting landscape happened faster than anyone, even I, had anticipated. Within 18 months of the National Defense Verification Standards Act passing, every major defense contractor had either developed internal verification systems compatible with the new standards or partnered with independent verification firms like Tate Verify. The industry that had once operated largely on paperwork, handshakes, and trust was now built on immutable digital records, distributed verification, and genuine accountability. Projects that had routinely run over budget by 50% or more were now coming in within 10% of estimates. Delivery timelines that had been considered optimistic suggestions were now firm commitments with real consequences for non-compliance. Most significantly, the quality of defense systems improved dramatically when contractors knew that every component, every test, every specification would be verified and permanently recorded on an immutable ledger. The incentives for corner-cutting disappeared. Tate Verify was at the center of this transformation. By our second anniversary, we had grown to over 200 employees and secured verification contracts across all branches of the military. Our Verify chain system had become the de facto standard, not just for defense contracts, but increasingly for critical infrastructure projects as well. The contrast with Avenix couldn't have been starker. After the Justice Department investigation expanded to include potential securities fraud specifically, allegations that the company had misled investors about its ability to fulfill the radar contract after my termination, Avenix entered a death spiral from which it never recovered. Grant Holloway had resigned, as had most of the board members who had approved my termination. Lindsay Barrett faced criminal charges for directing the falsification of test data on multiple government contracts. The company that had once been valued at over $3 billion was sold in a fire sale for less than $200 million, mostly for its physical assets and remaining intellectual property. I took no pleasure in Avenix's downfall. Too many good people, engineers, technicians, support staff who had nothing to do with the decisions that led to my termination lost their jobs in the collapse. Tate Verify hired as many of them as we could, particularly those who had worked with me on ClearTrace and understood the importance of rigorous verification. But I couldn't deny a sense of cosmic justice in how the story had unfolded. The very system that Avenix had tried to compromise the verification protocols I had built to ensure accountability had ultimately held the company itself accountable for its actions. 2 years after my termination, I found myself in an unexpected position delivering the keynote address at the Defense Technology Summit, the industry's most prestigious annual gathering. My topic: Trust, but Verify the Future of Accountability in Critical Systems, drew a standing room-only crowd. As I looked out over the sea of faces, military officials, government contractors, technology innovators, I felt a profound sense of responsibility. Tate Verify had grown beyond my wildest expectations, but with that growth came the obligation to maintain the principles that had guided us from the beginning. Verification isn't just a technical challenge, I told the audience. It's a human one. Technology can create immutable records and enforce protocols. But ultimately, verification systems are only as good as the people who design and operate them. The moment we prioritize expedience over integrity, profit over purpose, we begin the slide down the very slope these systems were designed to prevent. After the keynote, a young engineer approached me, clutching a copy of my presentation notes that I had made available to attendees. "Ms. Tate," she began hesitantly, "I just wanted to say how much your work has inspired me. I'm starting my career in verification systems, and the standards you've established are what drew me to this field." Her earnestness reminded me of myself at her age, idealistic, perhaps naive, but deeply committed to making a difference. "What's your name?" I asked. "Sophia Chen," she replied. "I just finished my PhD in distributed systems security at MIT. I smiled. "We're always looking for talented people at Tate Verify. Dr. Chen, send me your resume." Her eyes widened. "Really? I mean, yes, absolutely. Thank you." As she walked away, visibly trying to contain her excitement, I felt a surge of optimism. This was how real change happened, not just through technology or legislation, but through inspiring the next generation to carry the work forward. Later that evening, at the summit's reception dinner, I found myself seated next to General William Clark, the newly appointed head of the Defense Technology Agency. "I've been following your work with great interest, Ms. Tate," he said after introductions. "What you've accomplished with verification standards has applications far beyond defense." "How so?" I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. "Think about critical infrastructure power grids, water systems, transportation networks. All of them suffer from the same accountability gaps that plagued defense contracting. All of them could benefit from the kind of verification systems you've pioneered." He wasn't wrong. The principles we had built into Verify Chain could indeed be applied to virtually any complex system where accountability was crucial. "We're actually exploring some of those applications now," I admitted. "We're in early discussions with the Department of Energy about verification protocols for the new grid modernization initiative." General Clark nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of expansion I'd hoped to hear about. But there's another area where your expertise could be invaluable." "What's that?" He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "AI systems, particularly those being integrated into critical defense and security applications. The verification challenges there make hardware look straightforward by comparison." This was an area I'd been thinking about extensively, but hadn't yet found the right approach for. How do you verify the behavior of systems that are, by design, somewhat unpredictable? How do you create accountability for algorithms that even their creators don't fully understand? We're establishing a new joint task force focused specifically on AI verification and accountability. The general continued, "I'd like you to consider serving as a civilian advisor." It was an intriguing proposition. Tate Verify was stable and growing. With a leadership team I trusted implicitly, taking on an advisory role would allow me to help shape standards in an emerging field while still guiding my company's overall direction. "I'd be honored to contribute," I replied after considering for a moment. General Clark smiled. "Excellent. We'll be in touch with the details soon. And Ms. Tate." "Yes." What happened with Avanix was unfortunate. But in retrospect, it may have been the best thing that could have happened for national security. Some innovations can only come from outside the existing system. His words stayed with me long after the summit concluded. The general was right. Tate Verify had been able to effect change precisely because we weren't constrained by the institutional inertia and conflicting incentives that had hamstrung Avanix and other traditional contractors. 3 months after the summit, Tate Verify announced a major expansion, the creation of a new division focused specifically on AI verification and accountability. with Sophia Chen, the young engineer I'd met at the summit as its technical director. Her combination of academic expertise in distributed systems and genuine passion for accountability made her the perfect choice to lead this new initiative. The announcement generated significant media attention, including a feature profile in the Wall Street Journal titled, "From Betrayal to Billions: How Morgan Tate Transformed Defense Contracting." The article traced my journey from termination at Avanix to the creation of Tate Verify and the subsequent industry-wide changes, presenting it as a classic American success story, the wronged employee who rebuilt bigger and better than before. While I appreciated the recognition, I found myself uncomfortable with the article's framing. It presented the story as a personal triumph, a tale of individual perseverance and vindication. The reality was far more complex and collaborative. Yes, my termination from Avanix had been the catalyst, but Tate Verify's success had been built on the contributions of dozens of brilliant engineers and the support of forward-thinking officials like Eleanor Wright. The verification revolution wasn't my achievement alone. It belonged to everyone who had recognized the importance of accountability and worked to make it a reality. In response to the article, I published an open letter on Tate Verify's website, sharing credit with the many people who had made our success possible and emphasizing that the true measure of our achievement wasn't financial but systemic. The transformation of an industry from one where accountability was an afterthought to one where it was fundamental. If there's a lesson in my journey, I wrote, it's not about resilience or revenge or even innovation. It's about the power of aligned incentives. When we create systems, technological, organizational, or societal, where doing the right thing is also the profitable thing, the easiest thing, the most natural thing, then integrity becomes the default rather than the exception. The letter was widely shared and discussed, further cementing Tate Verify's reputation as a company that prioritized principles over profit. This reputation, ironically, made us even more profitable, as government agencies and private contractors alike sought to associate themselves with our brand of rigorous accountability. By our third anniversary, Tate Verify had expanded internationally, with offices in London, Seoul, and Singapore. Our verification protocols were being adopted by NATO allies and other strategic partners, creating a global standard for accountability in critical systems. And through it all, I kept Grant's handwritten letter in my desk drawer, a reminder of how easily principles can be compromised and how important it was that Tate Verify never follow the same path. The ultimate validation came 3 years and 2 months after my termination from Avanix, when President Hayes signed Executive Order 138, enhancing critical infrastructure security through verification standards. The order mandated Tate Verify compatible verification protocols for all federal infrastructure projects above $50 million. At the signing ceremony, I was once again invited to stand behind the president. As cameras flashed and officials applauded, I found myself reflecting on the strange, winding path that had led to this moment. If Avanix had honored my stock options, if they had treated me with the basic respect I had earned through years of dedication, I would never have founded Tate Verify. The verification revolution might never have happened, at least not in the same way or on the same timeline. Their attempt to save $850,000 had not only cost them billions, but had inadvertently launched a transformation that was now saving taxpayers billions annually while enhancing national security. Sometimes the most significant innovations arise not from careful planning, but from necessity, from the desperate scramble to rebuild after everything has been taken away. In my case, Avanix's betrayal had cleared the space for something far greater than what they had destroyed. As the ceremony concluded and attendees mingled, Eleanor Wright approached me with a warm smile. Did you ever imagine, when they called you into that conference room 3 years ago, that it would lead to this? She asked, gesturing around the Grand East Room of the White House. I shook my head. Never in my wildest dreams. I was just trying to survive the next day, the next week. I had no grand vision beyond proving them wrong. And yet here we are, she mused. Sometimes the universe has larger plans for us than we have for ourselves. I nodded, thinking of all the twists and turns, the moments of despair and triumph. That had brought me to this point. The question now, Eleanor continued, is what comes next. You've transformed verification for hardware systems. You're making inroads on AI and software verification. Where does Morgan Tate set her sights next? It was a good question, one I'd been asking myself with increasing frequency. Tate Verify was established and growing, with a strong leadership team that could function effectively even without my day-to-day involvement. The verification standards we had pioneered were being adopted globally. What more was there to accomplish? But even as I pondered this, I knew the answer. Verification was not a destination, but a journey, a continuous process of adaptation and improvement as technology evolved and new challenges emerged. The work would never truly be finished. Next, I replied with a smile, we make sure the systems we've built outlast us. We make sure the next generation of engineers understands why verification matters, not just how it works, but why it's essential to a functioning society. Eleanor nodded approvingly. Legacy thinking, I like it. Not legacy, I corrected gently. Foundation. We're not finishing something, we're just beginning. The real test of what we've built isn't what happens while we're here to maintain it. It's what happens after we're gone. As we left the White House that evening, walking down the iconic driveway toward Pennsylvania Avenue, I felt a profound sense of peace. The anger that had driven me in those early days after my termination had long since transformed into something more constructive, a determination to build systems of accountability that would endure. Avenix had tried to take everything from me. In doing so, they had inadvertently given me the opportunity to create something far more valuable than stock options or job security. They had given me purpose. And for that, in the strangest way, I was grateful. 5 years to the day after my termination from Avenix, I stood on the stage at MIT's commencement ceremony, preparing to deliver the keynote address to thousands of graduating students and their families. It was a far cry from the conference room where Grant and Lindsay had ended my career at Avenix, thinking they were saving $850, $1,000, while actually setting in motion changes worth billions. The invitation to speak at MIT had come as a surprise, though Tate Verify had become a case study at business schools across the country. I had largely avoided the speaking circuit, preferring to focus on the technical and operational challenges of growing our verification platform. But this invitation felt different, an opportunity to share lessons learned with a new generation of engineers and entrepreneurs who would shape the future. As I looked out over the sea of graduates in their caps and gowns, I was struck by how young they appeared, how full of potential and possibility, yet also how vulnerable to the same kinds of betrayals and disillusionments I had experienced. 5 years ago today, I began. I was fired from a job I loved, 9 days before my equity worth $850,000 was set to vest. It was a calculated decision designed to save the company money at my expense. The crowd grew quiet, perhaps surprised by the personal nature of my opening. That company, Avenix Solutions, no longer exists. The system I built, which they tried to manipulate, ultimately held them accountable for their actions. The verification protocols that they saw as obstacles to be overcome are now the industry standard, saving taxpayers billions while enhancing national security. I paused, looking out at the expectant faces. I tell you this not as a story of personal vindication, though there was certainly an element of that in the early days. I tell you this as a story about systems both technological and human, and how they either enable our best impulses or our worst. For the next 30 minutes, I shared what I had learned about the intersection of technology, ethics, and accountability. I spoke about the importance of designing systems that align incentives with integrity, that make doing the right thing the easiest and most natural choice rather than the most difficult. The greatest challenge you will face in your careers, I told them, is not technical, but ethical. It's not about whether you can build something, but whether you should. It's not about capability, but responsibility. As I concluded my address, I offered one final thought. 5 years ago, I thought I had lost everything. Today, I understand that what appeared to be an ending was actually a beginning. Sometimes the universe takes something from us to make space for something greater. Your setbacks, your failures, your moments of deepest disappointment. These may be the very catalysts that launch you toward your greatest contributions. The applause that followed was gratifying. But what meant more were the conversations that happened afterward, the students who approached to share their own ethical dilemmas, their own visions for accountability systems, their own hopes for building technology that would enhance human flourishing rather than diminish it. Among them was a familiar face, Sophia Chen, now the director of AI verification at Tate Verify, who had been invited back to her alma mater for the ceremonies. "Powerful speech," she said as we walked together across the campus afterward. "Especially the part about systems enabling our best or worst impulses." I nodded. It's something I think about constantly. Technology is never neutral. It always embeds values, priorities, assumptions about how the world works or should work, which is why verification matters. Sophia added, "It's not just about ensuring compliance, it's about making those values explicit and holding people accountable to them." Exactly. Speaking of which, how's the new AI verification framework coming along? Sophia's eyes lit up. We've had a breakthrough. The distributed consensus mechanism we've been working on, it's finally showing the kind of adaptability we need for generative systems. We spent the next hour discussing the technical details, walking the same pathways where Sophia had studied distributed systems just a few years earlier. The framework she and her team were developing represented the next evolution of verification, moving beyond static hardware and software systems to address the unique challenges posed by adaptable, learning AI. Later that evening, at a dinner hosted by the university president, I found myself seated next to Dr. Jonathan Keller, MIT's Dean of Engineering and someone who had been following Tate Verify's work with interest. "Your company has redefined how we think about verification," he said after we had exchanged pleasantries. "We've completely overhauled our engineering ethics curriculum based on the case studies you've published." This was unexpected but gratifying news. "In what way?" "We used to teach ethics as a separate subject, something students took alongside their technical courses but disconnected from them. Now we integrate accountability and verification principles into every aspect of the curriculum. Students don't just learn how to build systems. They learn how to build systems that can be verified and held accountable." "That's exactly the kind of integration we need," I replied, genuinely impressed. "Technical skills and ethical frameworks can't be separated if we want to build trustworthy technology." Dr. Keller nodded. "We're also seeing something interesting in terms of student interest. 5 years ago, the most talented students all wanted to work for the big tech companies or flashy startups. Now we're seeing a significant shift toward verification and accountability fields. Your story, and Tate Verify's success has shown them that integrity can be as innovative and rewarding as any other area of technology." His words stayed with me long after the dinner concluded. The idea that Tate Verify had influenced not just how verification was implemented, but how it was taught and valued, that was a legacy beyond anything I had imagined when I incorporated the company 5 years earlier. The next morning, before leaving Cambridge, I had one more appointment, a breakfast meeting with Eleanor Wright, who had retired from the Defense Technology Agency 2 years earlier and was now teaching at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. "How does it feel?" she asked as we settled into a quiet corner of the restaurant. 5 years since they showed you the door, and now you're delivering commencement addresses at MIT. I smiled. Surreal, honestly. Sometimes I still wake up and can't quite believe how everything unfolded. "I can believe it," Eleanor replied with certainty. "I knew from our first meeting that you were building something special with ClearTrace. The only surprise was that Avanix was foolish enough to let you go." "Their foolishness was my opportunity," I acknowledged. "But enough about the past. I'm more interested in what you're hearing from your students about the future of verification." Eleanor leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "They're asking the right questions, moving beyond technical implementations to social and institutional designs. How do we verify systems when the very concept of truth is contested? How do we create accountability in a world of deepfakes and synthetic media? These aren't just technical problems, they're social and philosophical ones. And they're exactly the problems we need to be solving." I agreed. Verification 1.0 was about hardware ensuring that physical systems met specifications. Verification 2.0, which we're in now, is about software and AI ensuring that digital systems behave as intended even when they're adaptive and learning. But Verification 3.0 will be about social systems, ensuring that our collective decision-making processes and institutions can be trusted in an era of synthetic reality. Eleanor nodded slowly. And who's going to build Verification 3.0? It was a question I had been pondering for months. Tate Verify had established itself as the leader in 1.0 and was making significant progress on 2.0, but 3.0 would require different approaches, different expertise, perhaps even a different organizational structure. I'm not sure yet, I admitted, but I know it's where I want to focus next. A new venture? Eleanor asked, raising an eyebrow. Possibly. Tate Verify is in good hands with the current leadership team. They don't need me for day-to-day operations anymore. Maybe it's time to build something new again. Eleanor smiled. The student becomes the master, and the cycle continues. Your protégé run the company while you innovate at the frontier. Something like that. I agreed. Though I prefer to think of it as concentric circles of impact rather than a linear progression. As we finished breakfast and prepared to part ways, Eleanor took my hand in both of hers. Whatever you decide to build next, Morgan. Remember this. What happened 5 years ago wasn't just about you and Avenix. It was about all of us, about the kind of world we want to live in and the systems that will make that world possible. You've already changed more than you know. Her words resonated deeply as I flew home that evening, looking out the airplane window at the patchwork of lights below. I reflected on the journey of the past 5 years, from the devastation of my termination to the triumph of Tate Verify and the verification revolution it had sparked. The company that had fired me was gone. Its name now a cautionary tale in business school case studies. The system I had built had not only survived, but had transformed an entire industry. The principles I'd fought for, transparency, accountability, integrity, were now embedded in federal regulations and international standards. But most importantly, the ideas had taken on a life of their own. They had inspired a new generation of engineers and entrepreneurs who were carrying them forward in ways I could never have anticipated. That, I realized, was the true measure of impact, not what you build yourself, but what you inspire others to build. Not what you accomplish alone, but what becomes possible because of the paths you've opened. 5 years ago, sitting in my apartment after being fired, I had been focused on survival and, yes, revenge. Today, I was focused on legacy and possibility, on the systems that would outlast any individual or company, that would enable trust and accountability for generations to come. As the plane began its descent into Salt Lake City, I made a decision. It was time to begin the next chapter, to start building Verification 3.0. Not alone, but in collaboration with the brilliant minds I'd met along the way. Not as a reaction to personal betrayal, but as a proactive response to the challenges facing society. The first iteration had been born of necessity, of the desperate need to rebuild after everything was taken away. The next would be born of choice, of the deliberate decision to create something new, not because I had to, but because I could see possibilities that others couldn't yet imagine. As I gathered my belongings and prepared to disembark, I felt a sense of anticipation I hadn't experienced since the early days of Tate Verify. The path ahead was unclear, the challenges substantial, but the potential impact was enormous. 5 years ago, Avenix had tried to take everything from me. In doing so, they had inadvertently given me the greatest gift of all, the freedom to build something that mattered, something that would endure long after both Avenix and I were gone. For that unexpected gift, I was finally, genuinely grateful. The transition from Tate Verify's operational leadership to my new role as strategic advisor happened gradually over the following 6 months. The company had grown to over 500 employees with offices on 4 continents, and the day-to-day management was already largely in the hands of the executive team we had built over the years. Alan Chen, who had followed me from Avenix to become Tate Verify's first employee, was now our CEO. Sophia Chen, no relation to Alan, had been promoted to Chief Technology Officer, overseeing our rapidly expanding AI verification division. The company was in excellent hands, freeing me to focus on the challenges of Verification 3.0. The question of what form this new venture should take occupied my thoughts constantly. Unlike Tate Verify, which had a clear technical focus and business model from the beginning, this new challenge was more amorphous. How do you verify truth in a world where reality itself can be convincingly manufactured? How do you create accountability for systems that operate beyond human comprehension? I began by assembling a small, interdisciplinary team, not a company yet, but a research group exploring the boundaries of what was possible. We called ourselves the Verity Collective, a deliberately ambiguous name that reflected our exploratory mission. In addition to technical experts in AI, cryptography, and distributed systems, I recruited philosophers, legal scholars, cognitive scientists, and media theorists. The challenges we were addressing couldn't be solved through technology alone. They required fundamental rethinking of how humans establish shared reality and collective trust. We set up in a converted warehouse, not unlike the one where Avanix had begun. The space was open and flexible, with whiteboards covering every available wall surface. It reminded me of the early days at Avanix, before growth and success had calcified into hierarchy and bureaucracy. 6 years to the day after my termination from Avanix, we gathered for our first formal symposium. Researchers from universities, tech companies, government agencies, and civil society organizations filled our modest space, drawn by the promise of addressing what many were beginning to recognize as an existential challenge: maintaining a shared conception of reality in an age of synthetic media and algorithmic curation. Welcome to the first Verity Symposium, I began, looking out at the diverse group of faces. We've gathered here because we recognize that the verification challenges of the next decade will be fundamentally different from those we've addressed before. I outlined the progression from hardware verification to software verification, and now to what we were calling reality verification, the ability to establish trust in the information that shapes our understanding of the world. The systems we're building today can generate text, images, audio, and video that are indistinguishable from reality. I continued. They can create synthetic personalities that appear more consistent and trustworthy than actual humans. They can construct alternative histories and present them with perfect citation chains to non-existent sources. The room was silent, the implications hanging heavy in the air. This isn't just a technical problem, it's a social one. It's not just about detecting fakes, it's about establishing new foundations for shared reality. And that's why we've brought together such a diverse group today. Over the 3-day symposium, we explored approaches ranging from cryptographic provenance tracking to cognitive inoculation techniques to new institutional designs for information verification. No single solution emerged, but a framework began to take shape, a multi-layered approach that combined technical, social, and institutional innovations. On the final day, as participants were sharing reflections and commitments, a familiar face appeared at the back of the room. It took me a moment to recognize him, older now, with gray hair and a beard, but there was no mistaking Grant Holloway, the former CEO of Avanix. Our eyes met briefly across the room, and I felt a complex surge of emotions: anger, certainly, but also curiosity and a strange sense of completion, as if a circle was closing. After the closing session, as people mingled and exchanged contact information, Grant approached hesitantly. "Morgan," he said simply, extending his hand. "Thank you for the invitation." I hadn't invited him and was about to say so when I noticed Alan Chen giving me a slight nod from across the room. Apparently, my former deputy and current CEO had thought this reunion was important enough to engineer. I shook Grant's hand briefly. "I'm surprised to see you here." "Alan reached out," he confirmed. "Said you were working on something important. I wanted to see it for myself." We stood in awkward silence for a moment, 6 years of history hanging between us. "What have you been doing?" I asked finally, more out of politeness than genuine interest. "Teaching," he replied. "Business ethics, ironically enough." using Avenix as a case study in how not to operate. His attempt at a smile didn't quite reach his eyes. I've been following your work from afar. What you've built with Tate Verify, it's remarkable. Thank you, I said simply, unsure where this conversation was heading. Grant seemed to sense my discomfort. I won't take up much of your time. I just wanted to say that what you're doing here, this Verity Collective, it matters. It might be the most important work anyone is doing right now. His sincerity caught me off guard. What makes you say that? Because I've seen firsthand what happens when trust breaks down. At Avenix, at first, it was just between you and the company. But it spread to our customers, our investors, our employees. Once trust is gone, everything collapses. And what you're addressing now is trust at a societal scale.